Good afternoon. Everybody hear me in the back? I probably don't even need the microphone. So just like church, everybody's in the back rows, front rows, except for a little bit on this side. Everybody's up front here. So appreciate that. So good afternoon, everybody. And my name is Justin Ingalls. I am with Young Seed Genetics as a regional brand lead. And we're happy, very, very happy to sponsor this seminar. We look at this as kind of a natural extension. Come on, play with me here, all right? Natural extension to our, in our commitment to the dairy producers and how they can be more profitable and more productive, utilizing all their resources. You think about seed genetics and the evolution of seed genetics the last few years and how traits have evolved. So has waste management, and that's what you're going to hear. That's what you're going to hear about today. Come on up front. Come on up front. Got plenty of seats. But we're going to hear about the utilization of those resources today. And I can honestly say waste management, it's not just in manure. That's just not crap anymore, right? You know, when we think about that. And you're going to hear our featured speaker talk about that today. So as you think about in the conversations today, you think about Young Seed Genetics for your seed needs here in Wisconsin, across the Midwest. Think about, and this includes our Silage Smart products, and that we can help you maximize your milk production with. So I'll jump right to our speaker. Today, we've got the honor and the pleasure to have Dr. Brad Jorn with us from Purdue University. He's going to focus on a few things today. One of the highlights when we were visiting in the back of the room was really around the value of manure. Making the nutrients that are available in manure available and combining that with some of our fertilizer recommendations and how we do that. So he's asked me to express to you that during the presentation that ask questions, make this interactive if there are some. Don't have to, if there's something, a point that needs some clarification or you've got a comment that you want to make to add to it, he'd be happy to take that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Jorn, Purdue University, to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay? Yeah. You know, people always say nice things when they don't know you.
We're more than 50 miles.
Right. So I've been at Purdue since 1991. I'm kind of known as the crapologist of the agronomy department. Most of my extension is dealing with people in Washington, D.C., whether it's EPA or NRCS. And so if you think that these policies are bad, I can tell you that they would have been a lot worse if I wasn't there. I don't win all the battles, but I've won enough to keep people in business. I think I should be full disclosure here. I'm from the I-States. I actually grew up in Cook County, Illinois, which definitely makes me a FIB. Which I believe stands for Friendly Illinois Buddies, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about manure, but you know, that's like the most boring thing in the world. It's everybody's fifth wheel is what the value of manure is. And so I want to transition from the value of manure to the value of our estimates for determining manure nutrient availability and also our fertilizer recommendations. Okay, so I'm going to slam everybody in this talk. So I want to show you that manure does have value, but then I want to show you how different our manure nutrient availability algorithms are from one state to the next and how different our fertilizer recommendations are. Has anybody really looked at that very much? Okay, because if you do, you know, all of these warm, fuzzy feelings go away in a hurry. And I'm a really opinionated person, so I'm going to give you my opinion of things that I think we're doing wrong, which is a lot of stuff. And I've been working on a nitrogen model to improve in-season nitrogen management, so I'll give you a quick tour of that, and then I'm going to give you a chance to tell me what I said that was wrong and what I need to carry back to Washington when I go see those pleasant people. So, I mean, we all know that manure has value. You know, there's nutrients that are excreted in manure, but you have to know a few things if you want to use it as a fertilizer product. You know, you have to know the nutrient content. Now, sampling manure is really, really challenging, right? I mean, if you take multiple samples, you'll get multiple results. And so I'm a big believer in looking kind of at this averaging over time, and if you have differences in water use between summer and fall, look at your summer analysis versus your fall analysis versus your spring and things like that. You have to know your application rate, obviously, because if we put a honey wagon full of manure or commercial fertilizer and we didn't tell you what the nutrient content is, you would have no idea what the application rate ought to be, but that's the way a lot of people manage manure. We also have to know something about losses between application and crop uptake, and this is where we have real challenges with our manure nitrogen availability algorithms. And then, kind of how do you come up with some kind of a strategy to apply manure to get the biggest bang for the buck? And so I'm from hog country, so we put a lot of quad units out there, 4,000 finishing hogs. They pump out about 2 million gallons of manure, and they generate about $110,000 worth of NP205 and K2O. I get away from the micronutrients and all the wonderful things about organic additions and all that stuff. I'm just talking about the big three here. And if you compare that to, say, 4-layer houses where you're going to get a ton, 2,000 tons of manure, that's about $126,000 worth of NP205 and K2O. And then, dairies are getting bigger and bigger. I don't even know what number to put up for a dairy farm anymore. Is it, I was just talking to somebody, they've got an 8,000 dairy up in the central sands. We've got a 36,000 cow dairy on our sandy soils in Indiana. I worked for a guy that had 50, and, we had a step saver, no pipeline, that kind of thing. But 750 dairy cows are going to generate about 4 million gallons of manure and generate about $150,000 worth of nutrients. So hog manure is more concentrated, okay? Has a higher analysis than dairy manure. You can generally afford to haul hog manure a little farther than dairy manure. And then poultry litter has a much higher analysis than either one of them, so you can afford to haul that the farthest. And so that really kind of enters into, how do you manage your manure? And then, of course, how many people are feeding DDGs or other byproducts, right? And you're not raising your hands, but you all do it, so I know that you do. Yeah, there's nothing the matter with it. It's just that, when we start looking at phosphorus and what the requirements of the animals are, as soon as we start getting into byproduct feed sources, we have a lot more phosphorus that's going into that system. And in addition, that phosphorus that's going in, if it's from DDGs, is actually available phosphorus. It's not like corn grain where it's not available. With dairy cattle, it doesn't really matter, but if you're feeding single-stomached animals, this is a big deal. But I actually had, not like I had it, I collaborated with a lot of animal scientists, and we had a student use high available phosphorus corn on dairy manure, or for dairy, and compared that to phytase. Phytase did nothing. High available phosphorus manure or low phytate corn grain, 40% reduction in nitrogen excretion on top of big reductions in phosphorus excretion. So it's just one of those things that we need to start pushing our diet balances and stuff a little bit more, because people that are feeding DDGs up until a couple years ago were just assuming that phosphorus availability was just as low as corn grain and single-stomached animals, and it makes a difference in ruminants too. The problem we have with manure, it's not a designer fertilizer. You don't call up and say, here's the analysis I want for my manure. It varies all over the place, and so do fertilizer recommendations. But if you just kind of look at nitrogen recommendations versus crop removal for P2O5 and K2O, corn grain's about a 3 to 1 to 1 ratio. Dairy slurry is more like a 1 to 1.5 to 1.5. And this would be, with a little bit of DDGs in it, right? Your results will vary, right? And so you kind of have to know the analysis of that material. So what I did is, the biggest thing to me is the value of your manure depends on where you put it, okay? Manure has phosphorus and potassium. And so phosphorus and potassium are really valuable fertilizers unless you're putting it on really high testing soils. And so, I started down here. I just made these numbers up, right? I mean, I could have used, less than 40 parts per million because that's about where our fertilizer recommendations go to 0 in the Midwest. So if you're applying 7,500 gallons per acre of dairy pit manure, and again, I come from the ivory tower, so this is during the application time where we don't lose any nitrogen, okay, which is never, but that's the way I'm calculating it here. So if we're going to put on 150 pounds of nitrogen at 50 cents a pound for nitrogen, that's worth $75. If your soil tests are greater than 100 parts per million phosphorus or greater than 250 parts per million potassium, you're crazy to be putting fertilizer on there and expecting to get any kind of economic response. And you've got to also look at it and say, I'm just putting that in a bank. Well, at some point, you're not going to get any interest back on that money, and you might as well put it in a mattress. And so I say that when your soil test levels get really high, you pick the number. I'm just giving an example. There's no value to that P2O5 or K2O. And of course, where are those fields? They're right near the slurry store or near the pit or wherever you've got your manure stored. And so my contention is you always have to fill that spreader, unless you got a hose pull system or something like that. But if you're hauling a honey wagon or a box or whatever, side slinger, you always have to fill that spreader, and you always have to haul to the closest field. So the additional cost of hauling is what's your labor demand at the time, and it's getting to be Thanksgiving. Once that bratty college kid comes home, gets his deer, then he ought to be out on that manure spreader, right? That's free labor. It's a good time of the year, so all temperatures are cold. As long as we don't have snow and frozen ground, then you get him to haul that out there, right? And whether you have a cab on that tractor is kind of irrelevant to you if you're not on it. So, so my contention is that you get that manure out to the fields where you can kind of say, I'm banking my P and K right now. Then at least you can take, say, this is a 2-year corn, soybean P and K removal. Okay, at least I can take that value. And at 50 cents a pound for all these nutrients, that's $110 per acre, regardless of when you apply it, because phosphorus and potassium, when you apply it relative to crop needs, doesn't really matter that much. Okay, and then if you can apply it at a time when you can take advantage of the nitrogen, potential bonus up to $75. And then if you go to those farther fields where you're actually buying commercial fertilizer, okay, you got to factor that in too. It's like I'm buying fertilizer now, and so what's the additional cost of hauling that manure versus the price of that fertilizer and that I'm buying and the value of the manure that I'm hauling, right? I can't tell you exactly what it is for any field or any situation, but I think if you just think about it that way, it's like, all right, when labor demands are lower, it's like we get our crops off, if we can be hauling manure in the fall, let's haul them to the farthest field. And if we have storage problems or something like that, well, the spring, that's when you're really under pressure, at least we are in Indiana, and that's where it probably doesn't pay to haul manure to the farthest fields because you're tying up too much labor and equipment, okay? So this is obviously not from Wisconsin. This is Minnesota dairy farmers. Are there anybody? Sorry, this is a World Dairy Exposition. This is from somewhere, some other planet, right? But if this is how you manage your manure, there's really nothing I can do for you, okay? And this is the way a lot of manure gets managed. We don't have our spreader calibrated. We have no idea where we are. We're running out of manure when we get a third of the way down the field. And so then we backtrack and we just compact the bejesus out of the soil when we're going back and forth, and we don't stop and start. We don't start back up where we stopped. We don't have kind of any kind of a pattern here where, if this was in the fall, which doesn't look like it, that looks like wheat, right? So this is a summer application. So what you ought to do is bust that field up, and how long does it take to empty your spreader? Okay. To me, the rate of application ought to be a function of your application equipment and the width of your field. Because if you only get 3/4 of the way across the field and then you're deadheading back to go get another load and then coming back and starting, you're wasting time and you're wasting money, right? So if you can have, you know, an old semi or something like that, an old bulk tank or something like that, where you can be transferring manure, you go up to one end, refill, go back the other way. You know, you start pushing the pencil around and you start thinking about the sins of soil compaction, and that kind of stuff pays off. You know, we always tend to say, well, we want to dial in that rate. Well, I'm sorry, even when we dial in that rate, then when it comes to actually taking credit for the nitrogen in that manure, we don't. We don't take as much as we need to. And so then we're largely ignoring it. So this is just out of our software. I know you guys use, what's the software you use? Was it? Snap Plus, yeah. So most of the rest of the enlightened world uses MMP. That's the software I do. No, we work with the Snap Plus people all the time. But when you're looking at, you come up with a nutrient management plan, this is Indiana, so this is September, October, November, December, right? Farmer doesn't like Christmas shopping. Can he haul 65 loads of manure that month? Yeah, that seems doable. And of course, he wants to haul it to the more distant fields. And so, as long as if you have your little GIS and you're figuring out how far your fields are from your storage, well, 65 loads of manure doesn't seem too bad, but I don't know about driving 475 miles back and forth on a tractor. Sounds too practical, right? And so when I look at that, I'm thinking, how big is your honey wagon, right? If this is a 2,500 gallon honey wagon, getting a 5,000 gallon honey wagon is going to cut that in half, okay? And it's going to cut the number of loads you're hauling in half. And maybe there's only certain periods of the year, right? Like in the winter, right? In the late fall, early winter, in this 3-year plan, where the distance flying around on the tractor just isn't practical. Well, maybe those are the times when you hire a custom hauler. Or you consider, I can cut all these values in half if I double the size of my spreader if I've got the tractor that can handle it. So just kind of common sense things. And then, of course, those more distant fields he's putting out at a high rate of manure, so the distance traveled while he's making those applications is pretty low. So just kind of think about all of that kind of stuff when you're developing a nutrient management plan. So I want to switch gears and start picking on my own kind, okay, the eggheads at the university. And because we're the ones that come up with these manure nutrient availability algorithms. And I'm going to tell you right now, they are woefully inadequate. And that's because we're in polite company that I'm using those terms. Generally speaking, time of application is not even considered when you're determining manure nitrogen availability. I mean, do you really believe that if after you harvest your wheat ground in July and you're putting manure on where you're going to grow corn next spring, that nitrogen is available as the nitrogen you put on at side dress time? I don't think so, okay? And so that's a really big problem. Many states don't even differentiate between total nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. One has to kind of mineralize, and the other one's already there, and all it has to do is nitrify and cause you a problem. Don't blame the eggheads too much on this, because there's no way for us to get funding to do this kind of research, just like there's no way for us to do fertilizer response trial research. At least in Indiana, we don't have a fertilizer checkoff program, so nobody's paying these bills, okay? So when we talk about available manure nutrients, potentially available nitrogen is basically all of the ammonium nitrogen plus some fraction of the organic nitrogen that we assume is going to mineralize during the growing season, okay? And that is generally a guess, okay? Everybody uses 35%. Except if it's poultry, it's 60%. Where those numbers came from, I think that they were first invented at Purdue during a conversation around a table, okay? And then everybody's just adopted them. I just don't necessarily put a whole lot of stock into those numbers. Some states consider animal type. Most all states consider the organic N from poultry litter to mineralize much faster than organic N from all other animals, because if you flipped up the tail feathers of a bird, They only have one hole, so they kind of poop and pee out of the same hole, and so they generate what's called uric acid, and that stuff is measured as organic nitrogen, but it's a lot like urea, and so it mineralizes much quicker. Okay? And then the type of manure storage also can have a big impact on that nitrogen availability. Phosphorus and potassium availability, I don't care what any university says, it's 100%. Okay? If your university says it's only 80%, it's 100%. Okay? Phosphorus availability, based on what I've done, is probably about 85% to 95%. Most states consider it to be 100% available, but phosphorus availability can be estimated by some states to be as low as 55%. Okay? I think in Wisconsin it's tied to soil test value, or at least it used to be. The lower your soil test value, the lower the percent of that available phosphorus. And it's not because it's not as available, it's just because, if you're not spreading that manure very uniformly, then the lower the soil test, the greater the chance for a crop response of skip. So if you put more on, then, maybe you'll be able to overcome that. Okay? So there's not going to be any quiz about this, but this is just a bunch of states and what they determine for manure nitrogen availability. And so how many years of credit does manure get? Well, in Wisconsin it's 3, in Indiana it's 1, in Massachusetts it's 6. Okay, 6 years for that organic end to mineralize. And then, how this is determined is all over the map. This is kind of phosphorus availability. Here's 60 versus 100 in Georgia. It's just all over the map, and I just don't believe that there's enough research to support that. I think that manure phosphorus availability can be slightly lower than commercial phosphorus availability, but most of the availability differences are due to spreading challenges. And so it's probably like 85 to 90% is available. And when you're putting manure on at a nitrogen rate, phosphorus is not a problem, okay? Because you're putting on way more phosphorus than the crop's going to use, okay? And this thing's not moving for me. Well, let's see. I had something pop up. Work for me. All right. Okay, so this isn't dairy manure, but it's just to show you how different manure nitrogen availability values can be as you go from one state to the next. And so this is Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Okay, and so Iowa has the highest percent. It's not really 100, it's 99, but I just rounded up to 100. If you inject liquid hog manure in Iowa, it's as available as commercial fertilizer. You inject hog manure in Wisconsin, it's 70% is available. If you surface apply and incorporate in less than 2 days, well, Iowa's availability drops 20%, Wisconsin stays exactly the same. Okay? And then if you surface apply that manure and you don't incorporate it, then Iowa drops a little bit, and so does Wisconsin. The thing that really gets me is, these states all share common borders, right? So if I'm farming in, say, Trempealeau or Buffalo County, then if I can get across the river, I can put more than twice as much manure on in Minnesota to get the same amount of available nitrogen as I can, well, not twice as much as Wisconsin, but what is that, 30% more? Okay, because Minnesota's availability is only 35, Wisconsin's 56. So, if you're a striped whistler from Iowa, then you take your hog manure from Iowa, you put it on in Minnesota, you can double your rate and still get the same amount of available nitrogen. I mean, come on, that's just nonsense. Okay, so farm on the borders. That's my message to you. Okay, take advantage of who's got the best deal for you depending on what you're doing. Okay, so we all know that manure nitrogen availability really depends on both the method of application and the time of application. So in my part of the world, we start hauling manure about now. It's still been a little bit too warm. Our soil temperatures are still too warm, but we haul right up until Christmas time. because we don't get the snow like y'all do. And you know, once soil temperatures start to drop, then the amount of nitrogen that you're losing during the fall goes way down. You'll still lose nitrogen in the spring, but you know, you might only lose 20% of that nitrogen versus losing, you know, 50% of the nitrogen if you apply it early, just because that nitrogen, the ammonium nitrogen becomes nitrate nitrogen, it leaches or it gets denitrified depending on your soils. When the temperatures are warm, you get a lot of denitrification on our heavier textured soils. Now, spring's an awesome time to apply manure, but we're too busy planting to make a whole lot of headway there. How did that get in there? That's the benefit of phosphorus, but not too much phosphorus, right? So I think that university manure nutrient availability algorithms are in the dark ages, and we need to work on them, okay? So that's kind of one of my take-home messages. And my other take-home messages, we're going to start talking about land-grant university fertilizer recommendations, okay? They're almost exclusively state-based because, by gosh, I am the extension fertility specialist in Wisconsin, and they're going to do what I tell them to do, right? I don't care what's going on in Minnesota or Illinois. And that's a result of history or pride. I think, I mean, I'm kind of a soil fertility person, and I think that we're all inbred. You know, every one of our major professors was either trained by Leo Walsh from here in Wisconsin, one of my favorite people on the planet, or Eugene Kamprith at North Carolina State University. And that's where those people learned all of these fertilizer recommendation approaches, okay? Well, you know, it's kind of a Stockholm syndrome situation when you're in graduate school, okay? You're getting punished all the time. You're working really hard, but you love that major professor. And so when they tell you this is how it's done, you will protect it and fight that to the death. And so it's not until we get another generation away until we start losing some of the protection of our fertilizer recommendations. And I'm one of the old people now, and I think the time is right for us to take a different approach. We have magic that happens at the state borders that I'm going to show you in a minute, and that magic means money. We need more regional and flexible approaches for making fertilizer recommendations. I believe in a rain-fed system. Anybody that tells you they can predict what your optimum nitrogen rate is without knowing what the weather's going to be like is crazy. We also are dealing with regulations now. Our fertilizer recommendations are becoming regulations. They weren't ever designed for that purpose, but if you are a regulated livestock producer, your regulatory agency points to the 590 standard, which points to the university fertilizer recommendations. So basically, our fertilizer recommendations are regulations. We can't provide recommendations that will optimize inputs for all management scenarios. Every farmer farms differently. We can't test everything. You know, we need more flexible guidelines, and we need better tools. My question to my colleagues is, do we have the guts to do this, to say, all right, I'm not going to protect my border, I'm going to protect my producer. So I just want to show you fertilizer recommendations. And so this looks like pickup sticks. And these are the yield goal-based fertilizer recommendations that we used to have in the Midwest. But a good yield back in the mid-90s when most of these came out was 180 bushels per acre. And at 180 bushels per acre, the optimum nitrogen rate went from 90 to about 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre, okay? Well, now we're using the maximum return to nitrogen fertilizer recommendations, okay? So we found out you can't predict yield. It's like if you can have a yield goal-based fertilizer recommendation, I'd be growing 500 bushel per acre corn. Forget that 300 stuff. I want 500 because I'll just plug that in to my yield goal, and then I'll know what my nitrogen recommendation is to get there. Well, we find out you can't do that. And so now it doesn't matter what your yield goal is. We're just telling you how much nitrogen to apply. Well, so what have we changed? Instead of going from 90 to 200 pounds per acre, now it's 110 to 200 pounds per acre. I don't think that's a whole lot of progress myself. Here's what our phosphorus fertilizer recommendations look like, okay? You have Minnesota and Nebraska that use what we would call like a nutrient sufficiency-based concept. So there, you're not building up the soil test level to a non-limiting level. You're just figuring out at a given soil test level, how much nitrogen do I need to get full yields this year? I'll worry about next year, okay? And so we have this group here that bottoms out at 20, and we have this group here that bottoms out, at 40. Okay, this is the Midwest. You all hear about these regulations coming from the East Coast, okay? Well, I always tell my farmers if they bring the East Coast regulations over here, it's going to be the Wild West. We all went to 0 at 40, okay? P1 or Malic 3 phosphorus soil test. When you get out to the East Coast, you got West Virginia, you got New Hampshire, and you've got Maryland that are still giving fertilizer recommendations 20 parts per million beyond where we stop. I thought when I did this that surely nobody, unless it's potatoes, is going to have recommendations beyond 60 parts per million, but I was wrong. Here's our potassium fertilizer recommendations. This is the one that gives us the most challenges, but realistically, we're not all that different. There's 3 states that are different from everybody else, but everybody else kind of, once you hit 150 parts per million, you're about at 0. And then out east, it's usually a little bit greater fertilizer recommendations. So what does this mean? So I said I'm growing 1,000 acres in the corn-soybean rotation, 180 bushel corn, 60 bushel beans. Soil test phosphorus is 15 parts per million. Soil test potassium is 100 parts per million. What's the fertilizer reckon? What's my 2-year fertilizer budget for 1,000 acres? Okay, it's $200,000 in Wisconsin. It's $220 in Michigan, $235 in Indiana, $245 in Ohio. Well, I can see nitrogen recommendations going up here just because we get more rain. Okay, not necessarily more precipitation, but we get more rain, and we get more rain in the spring. And then you come over here to Illinois. We know all about the politics of Illinois, and it's like, no wonder they had a fertilizer checkoff. Their fertilizer recommendations are so high. How can you justify, who has better soils, Indiana or Illinois? Illinois is all mollisols. Indiana is mostly alpha sols, lower organic matter. These are better soils. They should have a lower fertilizer recommendation than us, but it's almost twice as high. Can you imagine how much money people spend if they're following fertilizer recommendations from their land-grant university from one state to another? It's just all over the map. It just blows me away that we could sit there straight-faced and think that we have this problem answered. Okay. So the range goes from 95,000 to 393,000. There's 9 states less than 150, 13 states between 150 and 250, and 7 states greater than $250,000. Okay, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence in us. Okay, so how do we eliminate state border magic? Our recommendations should be soil specific. Okay, consider the soil type, the chemical properties of that soil, the physical properties of that soil, and the landscape position. Are you in the high or low part of the landscape? And the climate. What's your weather? What's your cropping system? We can't do all that research, so what we really need to do is collaborate and cooperate with farmers more. So we have to develop a tool that will allow them to develop their own experiments. You have to be high-tech enough to have a yield monitor on your combine. Doesn't mean you have to have RTK guidance, but it would be a lot easier. But if you have a shape file for your field, then you say how wide you want your plots to be. You just figure out what's the width of the combine, make it 1.5 or 2 times the width of your combine. It will automatically lay out all of your plots. We have something that does that, but I don't have time to show it to you. So the benefits of a regional approach is we could develop consistent sampling and analysis guidelines. Depends on what state, how far do you push the probe in the ground, how many samples do you take, and all of that stuff. We could develop more flexible risk-based approaches, and we could take advantage of your yield monitor combine data. We could take advantage of Soil Data Mart, and we can refine those soil polygon boundaries and all of those soil properties that are embedded in all of that stuff to help us make better decisions. So as a farmer, when I put on the farmer hat, if I'm you, I'm thinking, man, these recommendations are pretty, dictatorial. Are we using the build-up or the maintenance, build-up and maintenance or sufficiency level? Most states only use one of them. Okay, well, how much? Over half the land that's farmed is not even owned. It's rented land. and build up. Why would you build up the soil test level for the next person that's going to take over that land? So that automatically means on half the land, our fertilizer recommendations make no sense economically for the person that's using them. Okay? Farmers are looking at shorter profit time frames and reduced annual input costs. That we're really prescriptive. We build to the critical level and we draw down to the maintenance limit in the build-up and maintenance philosophy. We determine how long we're going to allow you to take to build up your soil test levels. So that means that you're kind of on the hook if you follow us blindly with fluctuating fertilizer prices. You don't have unlimited cash reserves. Maybe for the past few years you did, but certainly it didn't happen this year, right? And I think we're back to tough times now for a while. And so we need to, get with the program. And so as much as I hate modeling, I think we have to do kind of modeling and at least software to help, you all make better decisions. What's the crop to fertilizer price ratio? We need multi-year and single-year recommendations instead of having somebody else figure it out for you. If we have a build-up and maintenance approach and it says between 15 and 30 parts per million, you put on the same amount of fertilizer. As a farmer, if I'm, willing to bank, I don't want to build it up to 15. I want to build it up to 20 or 25. That becomes your soil test target. And then you decide how long it's going to take to get there. And then we should also be asking you, how much money do you have to spend? Because if we follow the fertilizer recommendations, we run out of money. Well, what we need to do is say, which fields really got to have it? Okay, what's the cost if we don't put that rate on? Is there places we can back off so we can reallocate those nutrients? Okay, so I want you to take a quick look at nitrogen. This is just what we have in Indiana. So when the MRTN thing first got started, Keith Kelling and I were involved in that, and I developed a spreadsheet, and part of the spreadsheet was location, so we could get weather and we could get soils information. And the idea was when we were all done, we weren't going to have fertilizer recommendations based on state. We're going to have fertilizer recommendations based on soils and climate and topography. Well, when it all got said and done, everybody has circled their state border, took their data, went home, and came up with what we have now. So in Indiana, we're kind of differentiating among different regions of our state. It helps a little bit, but if you look at the actual response data, I'm sorry this is fuzzy, it's not you, it's the slide. If this is what we say is the ideal rate, well, there's 30% of the time that our optimum application rate is actually lower than that, and there's 30% of the time when it's actually greater than that. And, a third of the time we're right. Well, I think we ought to be able to do better than that. And a lot of this has to do with what happens during the growing season. So this is, if we look at nitrogen response trial data from the same field over a period of years, we get different response curves. You put on a certain amount of nitrogen, some years without any nitrogen, the yield's really, really low, and it responds to a really high rate. Other years, you get pretty darn good yields, and it doesn't respond to a whole lot of fertilizer, and it's all based on the weather. Okay? So if you account for the amount of nitrogen that's mineralizing from the soil and losses that may occur, then everything falls on a really pretty line. Okay? So, my thing with any research approach, we can't test every soil, we can't test it every year, we can't test every management scenario. Timing of application, source, placement, tillage, cover crops, soil health, what's the deal with soil health and cover crops? Does it change anything? We can't do all of this stuff. And so I think we need to come up with a modeling approach, okay? So I've got a model that I've been playing with. I'm just going to show this to you really quick because I'm surely about out of time. Am I? Yeah, okay. So we have, we measure kind of soil moisture, and then we measure soil temperature, or we model moisture and temperature based on rainfall and temperature. And then we have the full nitrogen cycle. So if any of your kids are in college, they have to learn this if they're in agriculture. So we kind of determine on a daily basis how much organic nitrogen is going to mineralize, how much applied fertilizer, urea, ammonium, and nitrate have been applied, the amount of urea that could have volatilized or hydrolyzed, the amount of ammonium nitrogen that was converted to nitrate, the amount of nitrogen taken up by the crop, the amount of nitrate that would be lost due to denitrification, and the amount of nitrate that would be lost due to nitrate leaching, okay? And we have manure in here as well. And so I don't care if I'm right on any day, right? But over a period of a week or two, you know, I want to be right. And so as far as input data, I need to know where you are, because from that I get your soil texture with depth, I get organic matter with depth, I get pH, you know, and then I get the weather data. And so the only other thing I really need to know is what fertilizer have you already applied, when did you apply it, how did you apply it, you know, and that kind of thing. And then when did you plant, okay? And so that's all that has to go into that model. And then the model output is, you know, this green line is crop nitrogen uptake. So this, we start October 1st. That's kind of like the beginning of the water year, right? Beginning of stick season. And so we look at mineralized nitrogen, okay? And so we have nitrogen mineralizing in the fall until, you know, you get to December around us. Then it really shuts down until the spring it goes back up. And then we have nitrate leaching, because we do have nitrogen left over after our crop is grown. And, you know, our soils are usually dry right after harvest because we've had a lot of evapotranspiration. Once the soil fills up and it starts turning into mud season, then we get some nitrate leaching, and just kind of on and on and on, right? And so what I did is I applied this to our nitrogen response trial data in Wisconsin. So this is kind of, our model predicts nitrogen uptake by corn, and then, I'm sorry, these are in metric units. I didn't realize that, but it doesn't matter. It's just that when our model starts showing these points on top of each other, that means it's not taking up any more nitrogen, so there's not going to be any more response to fertilizer. And so our model fits really well. And so I talked to Jim Cambarato, who's our kind of our nitrogen specialist, and I said, this model works too well, and so he gave me some more data, and so I plotted it, you know, because he had some data where he did late side dress applications of nitrogen, you know, like at VT or at tasseling, or just before tasseling, or at the, you know, 9-leaf stage of growth, and this model was like almost flawless. And so then I went to Nebraska, and I talked to Charlie Wortman, who's the nitrogen guy there, and he gave me his response data. And in Nebraska, on these irrigated sands, it's really more of a straight line relationship until you get enough, and then putting more on just kind of puts everything bunched at the top. And they also had soil samples they took to 3 or 4 feet. And so this is the date when they pulled those soil samples. This is the depth that they pulled those soil samples. This is the amount of nitrate nitrogen that they measured. And then this is the amount of nitrate nitrogen that my model predicted. So there was actually 31 pounds. We measured 42, so we were off on that one. 32, 31, 68, 67. Then we went to 4 feet, 79, 74, 85, 88, 85, 88, 85, 87. Almost perfect, right? I mean, I just can't believe how good this is working. But in the real world, we're not farming 20 feet by 80 feet. Okay, where when we say we're on this soil, we're on that soil. In the real world, you're farming big acres, and the soil's varying, topography varies, and all that stuff. And so we're trying to test this model across different climatic conditions, adding more crops, because corn and winter wheat's the only thing we have. And then net precipitation based on variation in topography and soil. So the idea with net precipitation is if you have an undulating landscape, at the high spot of the landscape, if you get a 1-inch rainfall, that soil perceives it as a 1-inch rain. You get on that slope, you're going to get some runoff. Okay, so that might only be a 3/4 inch rain in that part of the field. And then in the low part of the landscape, that could be 2, 3, 4-inch rainfall. And that's going to drive nitrogen loss. Okay, so here's how much, you know, yield varies. Okay, the darker the color, the higher the yield, and you can kind of see that there's higher yield here, and it's kind of associated with soil map units, but not perfectly. This was 2008, which was a really good year. 2012, same field, it was a drought, but still those high yielding areas still kind of showed up. Okay. Here's a manure study that I did where we were looking at application timings from manure, August, September, October, November, with and without instinct, and compared that to 120, 160, and 200 pounds of nitrogen in the spring. And, you know, there's all these different rates and timings of application, but in 2012 when we had a drought, the only thing that mattered was what soil you were on. Okay, this is a Brookston soil. It's a poorly drained, high organic matter soil, high water holding capacity, and then this is the Crosby, which is kind of its sister soil in the higher part of the landscape, and here's the sloping part of the landscape. And so what it shows is that soil really matters, and it also shows that the soil polygon boundaries are not really perfect. Okay, so I tried to run the model in a spatial context. This is a little tiny field, 8 acres, right? But I have soil that's 6% organic matter and versus one that's 1.5% organic matter. And so we look at topography, and we look at the soils, and we come up with this thing called the topographic wetness index, which is where water is going to accumulate. And then it was a single uniform rate of nitrogen across this field. Our model predicted high yields here and high yields here, and we're kind of bounded by the soil polygon. Okay. Then they came back with the yield monitor on the combine. Well, high yield here and high yield here, but this high yield extended out beyond here because this soil polygon probably goes more like this than like this, and then this low yielding area should all shift over to the left a little bit. This soil doesn't occupy that big of a spot in the landscape. Okay, so I think the model works, but now we're limited by the input, right? So I have another colleague that's doing some stuff to kind of come up with a continuous map of soil properties, and we'll see where that takes us. So just to kind of finish up here, everything we do in the future has to be done in a spatial context. Okay, you know, you have to know your soils, you have to know the topography. Any of this row by column business is just kind of out the window, and it's been out the window for a while. Our fertilizer recommendations and future risk assessment tools for nitrogen, phosphorus, you know, for fertilizer, and then sediment transport, that needs to become more regionally based so we don't have magic at the state boundaries. And we have to emphasize adaptive management. We have to get farmers directly involved in research, right? When we get a grant to study something, we're limited to studying that one thing. You can study anything you want, whenever you want. And so my idea is like a research cooperative where you would buy this piece of software or rent it, and then you can do whatever trial you want. You send us the data, we automatically analyze it, send back the results, but all of the data goes into whatever that cloud is, and you get enough people participating, and somebody's like, I want to know irrigated potato nitrogen rates on a plain field sand, and so how many people did that study, and what was the weather, how much irrigation water did they put on, and what was the product, what seems to be the best management, right? And then everybody learns from it, okay? Nitrogen recommendations. Spring planted crops, you know, coming up with a recommendation beforehand is of little value in rain-fed systems. All of the MRTN rates are based on either late pre-plant or side dress applications. Anybody do any fall applications up in Wisconsin? No, surely you don't, right? Yeah, they don't do it in Illinois either, okay? But you know, if you're not following our BMPs, then our nitrogen fertilizer recommendations don't apply to you. Okay, well that's not very helpful. There's a 2-to-1 yield difference in most fields. You know, like I say, our corn recommendations are based on best management practices, so that provides no guidance for many of you. Modeling approaches are needed that account for weather, soil and topographic factors, you know, planting date, stage of crop development over time, things like that. Pea fertilizer recommendations. My personal feeling is that we should be moving away from the buildup and maintenance approach and going to the nutrient sufficiency-based approach, okay? More than half of our land is rented. Annual applications are becoming the standard now. It used to be farmers were applying for 2 years. Now they're going back to 1 year. Producers are looking at shorter time frames. And if you look at, you know, the amount of phosphorus you need to get into the non-responsive range in a buildup and maintenance philosophy, we're basically asking you to apply 200 or 300 pounds more P2O5 per acre. We're taking money out of your pocket, okay? The buildup and maintenance approach increases phosphorus losses by about 0.2 of a pound per acre per ton of soil erosion compared to the nutrient sufficiency level if you just look at soil test value alone. So say at the nutrient sufficiency level you top out at 20. At the buildup and maintenance you top out at 30. That's 10 parts per million, takes 20 pounds P2O5 per acre to increase your soil test by 1 part per million. That's 200 pounds. Okay. So at a minimum, both approaches should be available to producers. So if I'm renting land, I'm going to use the nutrient sufficiency approach. If I have homestead land that I'm willing to invest in, then I'll use the build-up and maintenance approach. But I want flexibility in how I use it, okay? A couple final thoughts. This is going to really make y'all hate me. If I was king for a day, I would ban surface applications of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers on frozen or snow-covered ground tomorrow, okay? It's just wrong. We've got plenty of ability to apply this at other times. Early fall is a great time to apply it because our soils are dry. Usually we get these gentle rains. The fertilizer gets pushed into the soil and then gets held by the soil, okay? I mean, at least in our part of the world, early fall is great, late fall is bad because the soils start becoming saturated. Spring is an awful time because our soils are saturated. The minute we can get out there, we start running around applying fertilizer, then we get rain, water has no place to go, so everything runs off, okay? Surface applications of manures on frozen snow-covered ground. Can't ban it because animals are not like tubes of toothpaste. You don't squeeze them and get that manure out when you want it. When that pit's full, you got to haul. But you know, if we don't have enough storage, then we got to be sensitive to that and say we're going to double our setbacks and we're going to half our application rates. That's what we do in Indiana. And farmers should be putting pressure on their dealers to get the fertilizer industry to bring back triple super, okay, and make it prill better so it's not a mess to work with. Because as we get into this Mississippi River Basin stuff, deeper and deeper, you're applying, you know, we were switching from DAP to MAP, now we're back to DAP, so now we're applying a lot of nitrogen in the fall with that phosphorus fertilizer that we don't need. None of you take any credit for it whatsoever. It's just going down the river. If we were using TSP, at least we wouldn't be applying that nitrogen, okay? All right, so with that, I'm going to stop. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm like every other fib, I'm going up to Minocqua. You know, so I know that if anybody spend any time up there, go up there during Labor Day. On the way back home, if you're up there Labor Day weekend and you're a fib, the whole town of Hazelhurst kind of sits out there with lawn chairs and just waves as the Chicagoans are going back home for the winter. So, all right, but I'm heading back up there. Yes, Leo.
For all the recommendations that you say that are off in the seed, what are we supposed to do then?
Well, it's a philosophy problem, right? And it's like we're saying that my state is so different from your state. I'm saying we ought to come up with a similar approach, and then let's justify why we might have differences in fertilizer recommendations. But my biggest thing is that except for 2 states, Nebraska and Minnesota, we all use the build-up and maintenance approach. So if you follow our fertilizer recommendations and you only have a 1 or 2 year lease and the soil test is low, you're applying more P&K fertilizer than it takes to grow a full crop because you're trying to build up the soil test level. Well, why in the world would you do that when you're not going to get the return on that investment? You know, so that to me is a big issue. Yes?
I'd like to challenge you a little more on that.
Okay.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with you. You're trying to optimize the nutrient value on manure. So when you're in a crop rotation, you've got corn, you've got alfalfa. And I never like the surface applied.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we want to incorporate, we want to over-apply a little bit of phosphorus and potash on the corn ground before silage ground to get up there, and then you can rotate that to alfalfa and then run it down a little bit. And that gives us, you don't have to completely balance fertilizer, but it's a great way to balance it. So if we use nutrient curve to build the soil up,
Mm-hmm.
you use that model. You take a long-term view of it. That's not our model. Our model is only land on a long-term releases and manage that way so you get optimal use of the manure. What's wrong with that idea?
I'm 100% on board with that. When I'm not talking about manure here. When it comes to manure, okay, you know, this is just commercial fertilizer, right? Because I switch gears, and when you're going to commercial fertilizer, it's like, why over budget yourself? When it comes to manure, I say go with a nitrogen-based rate every time you apply manure, because I would rather see you over-apply P and K, mine that out over time, because if you go with a nitrogen-based rate, you're putting on as much P and K as you can because you're limited by nitrogen. So you're only compacting the soil one time, right? As opposed to applying it at a phosphorus-based rate or a potassium-based rate. Well, now you have a lot more acres to cover, so now you're going to be compacting a lot more soil, and you're going to have to go back and compact it again sooner. So yeah, completely different scenario that I'm talking about. I'm 100% on board with you when it comes to manure, 100%. And you thought we were going to get in an argument. Okay. Yes? No. That was completely tongue-in-cheek. That was, no. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we programmed your fertilizer recommendations before SNAP Plus. We did it first. Now we haven't reprogrammed your phosphorus index because it's so damn complicated. But the only reason we haven't is because, you know, I don't get paid because somebody uses our software, and Wisconsin has a piece of software that they've invested a lot of money in, and I don't want to start some, you know, war among consultants that say, well, I'm going to use SNAP Plus and I'm going to use MMP, and you know, it's like, you know, so we just kind of, we collaborate with Wisconsin. We are going to program the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index this year, but it's not like we're going to push the use of it. There's just one consultant that just will not leave us alone, and he's constantly calling and say, when are you going to get that done, because I like that software better. And it's only because consultants that work in multiple states can use one piece of software and deal with it, right? You know, that way you're not having Microsoft Word for Wisconsin, and then you go to Indiana, it's a completely different system and that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's the only reason. And I was completely teasing about SNAP Plus. Yeah. Well, nobody loves doing nutrient management plans, so it doesn't really matter what software you use. And they're worthless anyway. You know, I mean, the thing about, do I have time to tell a story? Okay. Here is the level of understanding of the people that were putting the CAFO rule together. Okay. I was in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to mention the person's name, but I was showing them a nutrient management plan. And this person, and I said, this field's under continuous corn. And the person said, continuous corn? What's that? And before I could answer, they said, oh yeah, that's right, it grows year-round down south. Not a lie. Okay? Then I said, this field has a cover crop because it has real sloping soils, and this was in Kentucky. And I said, and here's the kill date of the cover crop. And they said, why would you kill a cover crop? And I was like, well, you know, there's another crop that actually pays the bills, and so you have to get rid of that crop. You know, you're protecting the soil. And I mean, this is the level of understanding of the people that are in charge of our livelihoods. And so every time I go there, it's Groundhog Day. I feel like Bill Murray every time I go to Washington, D.C. You know, whoever they talk to last is their knowledge base. And so you have to go there. You have to be active. No matter how frustrated you get, you have to be polite, which is really difficult for me. And then, but you just got to keep going back and doing it. Otherwise, we're just going to erode away. Because Indiana, I think, is the only state that could implement the CAFO rule today, because we don't have a phosphorus index. We look at all these different things. You have to address any loss issues. And then application rates are based strictly on soil test level. Every other state that has a phosphorus index, you change one thing, it changes your phosphorus index. And then there's a whole cycle of things that you have to do in order to actually follow the EPA CAFO rule. And I said to the person, not the person that's in charge, but the person that does the work, I said, you know, this is going to just result in a lawsuit. She goes, yeah, well, we know that. That's kind of why we're doing it. You know, so it's like they're waiting for the lawsuit so they can kind of get this thing kick-started again, so they can bring some reason to nutrient management implementation. The planning part's fine. The implementation part's impossible. Nobody keeps records. I mean, I know less than 10% of the people I know keep records. Can't imagine farmers are any different. And so your livelihood's on the line by the records that you keep, and I think that's unfair, which is why as we get more modernized equipment, the records are in that black box, and that's where they should stay. Yes?
Now, we're in the New York City watershed, we have to write, we have so many loads on every field, and we have to write it down and report it into the program every year. So they keep records from year to year that you're doing.
So you have to submit it? Okay. 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 So in Indiana, you're supposed to keep records, but they do an inspection about once every 5 years. But you know, the only thing that you really get is the ag stormwater exemption if you have a nutrient management plan, which is really a big deal. You know, two people do the exact same thing, knife in manure, and you get a heavy rainfall. You get a runoff, a spill that causes a fish kill. The person who has the nutrient management plan and the records to go with it gets the ag stormwater exemption and doesn't get fined. The other person gets fined $26,500 per day. You know, that's how EPA got around it, because you know the judge said that you don't have to apply for an NPDES permit anymore. You just say I'm not going to discharge. And in Indiana, it never made sense anyway, because we're a non-discharge state. So you apply for a non-discharge point elimination system, and in it says I'm not going to discharge. That doesn't make any sense. So, all right, I'm keeping you way beyond where you're supposed to
Any
go.
other questions as we close? All right, again.
And I'm not forgiving any of you Wisconsinites for that Bears game the other night.
Well, I think the Wisconsinites are enjoying that. So, I appreciate you attending. Thank you for your questions. And again, let's give the doctor a hand. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Hey, and I went to River Falls, by the way.